Hi, I'm Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made a miniature pub from scratch. I've used this miniature set on my last stop motion animation. If you haven't seen the short film, I'm going to put a link above and in the description below. This miniature set comes in two parts and I'm going to show you how I made it step by step. First, I'm going to start by showing you how I made the main structure in wood. Then how I made the bar, the shelf, the fireplace, the wooden floor, every single piece of furniture, every little props, even a beer pool. And then how I made the ceiling with the wooden beam and the LED lights. And to finish off, I made the front of it. Enjoy the video. First, I made a sketch of my pub to decide of the layout and design every component, their position, their proportion. Then I cut some 12mm plywood with a jigsaw, and I also cut some studs. Then I line up my piece of plywood on top of the studs, drill into it to connect the two, use a countersink drill bits to make sure the screw will sit flush, and then screw it together. And this is my base all assembled. Then I've cut some other pieces of plywood to create the wall. I line them up on my platform, drill into it, and screw them together with some washer. I've started to work on the layout of my set and I wanted to create a little wall for my fireplace. So I took two pieces of plywood, I took some little metal brackets and changed the angle of it to fit my design with some pliers. Then I just placed those brackets onto the plywood and screwed them in place. Check that it was the correct angle and that it fits nicely on my set. Then I fill up the gap with some wood filler, let it dry, and then sand it down. Then I realized I forgot to cut the fireplace opening, so I did that with the jigsaw. I've added more bracket to be able to attach it to the back wall. I've placed my third wall back onto the platform and start to work on the main bar. First, I build up some volume with some cardboard and a hot glue gun. I keep adding up layer until I have the right thickness and finally add a piece of leftover plywood for the front part. I hot glue it to the main base. To create a nice traditional feel for a pub, you need to create a bar with different architectural trim. So I'm going to show you how to make them all from scratch. To make the template of a pillar, first I took a little piece of basswood, a different thickness, and assembled them together until I had a design I like. Then I hot glue them together. They don't need to look pretty, they just need to be the right shape. This is how it looks when I've sanded down and removed the excess of glue. Then I use a bit of Worbla. If you have seen some other tutorial of mine, you know I use this material all the time because it's absolutely brilliant. It's a thermoplastic that you heat up with a heat gun and apply it, and it will take any shape you want. I apply it to the pillar and use sculpting tools to mark every line. Once it was completely cold, I can take it out of the mold and then I just fill it up with some basswood so I have something to work with when I want to attach it to the bar. I've added lots of other components, some skirting, some paneling. I've hot glued some thicker basswood for the worktop, and then I start to focus on the back wall. I made a detailed sketch to scale to define the position and proportion of everything, and then I copy that sketch onto my plywood. Then I start the same thing then with the bar. I build up some volume with some cardboard first. The top layer was this time some craft foam. Then I hot glue it to my piece of plywood, add some worktop with some basswood, and start building up all the shelves with some basswood that I've already cut to size and sand down. I've added some doors for what was supposed to be the cabinets underneath the shelves. I've decided to create a separating wall by just piling up a piece of craft foam with a hot glue gun. I've hot glued a piece of basswood on the front and sand it down. Then I hot glue the wall in place. I've also decided to make a toilet door because if it's a pub you need a toilet. So once again just took some strips of basswood and built up until I had a nice shape. Then I primed the whole thing with some white gesso, and while that was drying I started focusing on the paneling. I've started my paneling by first adding the skirting, then build up with some really thin strips of basswood. I use a spacer to make sure there's the same space in between each batten and kept building up until I was happy with it. Then I primed the whole thing with white gesso. Now I'm going to talk about the fireplace. I've used the same pillar that I created before for the bar and used some wobbler to shape them to this pillar, but this time I just trim it down because I wanted those pillars to be shorter for my fireplace. So I cut them to the size I wanted and used some basswood and hot glue gun to fill up the gap but also connect those two pieces and reattach them together. Then I've attached it to the main wall and keep adding bits of basswood until I had a nice shape for my fireplace. I've also added some skirting to blend everything together and primed the whole thing with white gesso. Then I start painting all the walls, starting with a nice green as a base. When the primer was dry on the fireplace, I wanted to add some filler to fill the gaps. And I use paper au sand relief all the time for this kind of things because it's got a really nice applicator, so you go into all the little details. Now going back to the bar, I wanted to replicate the pillar that I use on the bottom part of the bar to create the canopy, but this time I create the same pattern just longer, and I made two of them. I warm up a piece of wobbler, apply it onto it, and this time I wrapped the wobbler all around it because I wanted to keep the basswood inside of it so it's stronger to hold the canopy above the bar. Then I start building up the canopy with lots of different thicknesses of basswood. I've also created some cutout for the wine glass to slide into and just kept building up. I've also sanded down all the edges, make sure it's nice and smooth. I've also added some architectural trim at the front to match with the design of the pillar underneath. Then I've hot glued the 4 pillar underneath to be able to connect to the base, and finally hot glue it to the base. Then I primed the whole thing with white gesso. I've started applying some acrylic paint throughout, 2 coats everywhere. Apply a clear sealer to seal the paint and then distress it by applying a darker black or grey paint and remove the excess with a wet paper towel. To create the flooring, first I've aged and distressed some basswood and I use a screwdriver to do that. Then I've cut some strips of 1 centimeter. I've applied a thick coat of PVA on my base and start applying the plank. And I wanted to use different lengths and different thicknesses to create this realistic floor in old pubs, which is usually a bit all over the place. And I think that gave it much more character. Then I've applied 2 coats of acrylic paint, seal it with the clear matte sealer, apply some diluted brown paint, and remove the excess with a paper towel. Dry brush it with a beige to highlight all the texture. I've hot glued a little earth that I made with some basswood for the fireplace. To blend everything together, I've applied some diluted brown paint and removed the excess with a wet paper towel. For the insert of the fireplace, I created a template first with a piece of basswood to the shape I liked. Set up this template on top of 2 blocks of basswood. Warm up a piece of black wobbler and stretch it on this template. Once it was cold, I can trim it out. I'm sorry for the image being completely out of focus. So there you go, I have a nice shape for my fireplace. So now I do it again for the basket of the fireplace. Once it was cold, I trim it down much more significantly than the other part. Make sure it matches with the initial insert. And cut out the grates to create the baskets. Then I glue that grate to the insert and add some detail with the paper au sand relief. I think it makes it just more interesting. Initially, I've placed it with some gaffer tape because I knew I would have to go back to it later on for the LEDs. To make it more realistic, I've also sand down underneath where each stool was supposed to be, because by those furniture being moved around, they will automatically age the floor further. Then I protect all the paint with a clear matte varnish. And now I'm going to talk about the brick or stone wall. I used some 5mm EVA foam and marked some line onto it as reference. I didn't want to have a precise brick wall as I usually do when I mark a line every 1 centimeter horizontally and vertically. I want something more organic. So I decided to go freehand and follow some of the line but not completely. I wanted something more wobbly and something much more interesting for me. And the same thing for when I separated the stones. Sometimes I made a small stone, sometimes a bigger one. I've used a wood burning tool to do that, and I've done it outside with mask and gloves. I wanted to distress it further, so I went in between the bricks and dig deeper with the wood burning tool. This is how it looks like before the priming. Then apply some white gesso, 2 coats of acrylic paint, and then starting to add lots of different colors with a sponge. Then I sealed it, apply a dirty wash with diluted paint that I remove the excess with a wet paper towel, dry brush it to highlight all the details, and finally protect it with a clear matte varnish. Then I use a contact adhesive or contact cement and spread it on the whole foam. I've also applied it on my plywood. Let it dry roughly 10 minutes until it starts being tacky, and then assemble together and press it. Now I'm going to talk about the ceiling, the beams and the LEDs. I took a piece of 9mm plywood as a base and add up lots of different wood strips on top of it to create the design I liked. Then I primed the ceiling, paint it and add different colors to just make it a bit more interesting. Then I've aged the beam. First you get rid of all the edges. I usually use a screwdriver for that, and then you create some much deeper dent to age and distress the beam. Then I apply some diluted brown paint throughout, and I dry brush with a lighter beige for the texture. Once they were completely dry, I hot glue them in position. Use some rulers and reference point to make sure they line up correctly. Then I drill some holes for my lights. I flip the ceiling around and start working on the back. I used probably 5 of micro LEDs that I've grouped together and then pressed to fit as many as I can through those holes. And I hold it in place with gaffer tape. Now I'm going to talk about furniture, and starting with the stool. I made a sketch of the stool I wanted to create and design a template for each legs. I used these templates on each strip of wood to copy the reference point, and I mark it on 2 sides. That's going to be handy later on. And use a metal file and slowly carve those lines in. And because basswood is so soft, if you have metal files, it will take no time to get the shape you want. And this is how they look. For the seats, I've used a 5mm thick basswood and sand it down to create a nice shape. I mark some line on that seat. I use some super glue and attach the legs to the seats. Don't forget to add some wood in between the legs to make sure they hold it properly and to reinforce the structure. Then I've applied a white gesso because I knew the super glue will not take the paint the same way that the bare would, so it primed the whole thing and have a better look later on. Then I've painted, sealed, aged and varnished every stool. For the table, I used some 5mm thick basswood, use a roll of tape to define the circle and the dimension I needed, cut the excess with a little Japanese sew, and super glue the legs onto this table. Now I'm going to talk about the other seating in the pub or miniature booth. I made a sketch to define the component that are going to be underneath and the cushion above. And I use a big block of basswood to cut the base of my seating. I've hot glued it together and sand it down. Then I painted with acrylic paint. For the cushion, I used some 10mm EVA foam because that's what I had on hand, and I sand it down to smooth the edge. I've marked some line every 1 centimeter on it and used an X-Acto knife to follow up those lines. I didn't go all the way through, but halfway through only. And on the intersection, I went all the way through this time. With the magic of EVA foam, once you apply a heat gun on a low setting, it will round itself up. Then I've applied some cotton on it and start going in and out with a thread to define the shape of the cushion. Once I was happy with the front, I used the hot glue gun to attach the fabric at the back for the edges. Then I've hot glued those cushions to the base of my seat. I've glued the back as well. With all this hot glue added, there was a bit of a gap in between. So I've used the Pebble Sand Relief, which is not supposed to be a filler, but I use it as a filler. And once it was dry, I can just add a little paint, it blended quite nicely. And I'm happy with the results so far. Now I'm going to talk about the lighting above the bar. To create those little lamps, I've used 3 meters of micro LEDs and some Worbla. To create the lampshade, I've used black Worbla and a large sculpting tool. To create the light bulbs, or what is supposed to be the light bulb inside of it, I use a smaller sculpting tool and some clear Worbla. Now I warm up the Worbla, apply it and stretch it on my sculpting tool, and then use the X-Acto knife to mark a line throughout when it was still warm and soft. I've done the same thing with the small sculpting tool and the clear Worbla. Once it was completely cold, I can take it out and trim it down with a scissor. So there you have it, the lampshade and the clear light bulb. I had to drill the base of the lampshade to make sure I can pass the LED through. Then I drill onto the canopy of the bar, cut some opening from underneath. I should have cut it earlier, that would have been way easier, but anyway. Then I pass, I think it was 3 or maybe 5 meters anyway, of micro LEDs throughout, pass it through the little holes, and then I have to press it to be able to feed them through the lampshade. I've adjusted until I had a nice position for them. Then I super glued the clear dome, which didn't want to get in very easily. It was tricky to get this to fit. I've also added another 5 meters of LED at the back to create another source of light, and they look really nice when they bounce on the ceiling. Then I've printed some vintage sign on self-adhesive paper that I've added to the sets, some little frames and detail that you find in the pub. Now I'm going to talk about the view. First I made a sketch to the right scale and defined the component that is to be in and their proportion. Then I took different pieces of leftover basswood in different thicknesses and start to make a dry fit first before gluing everything together to make sure they are the right proportion and that they will fit nicely together. I've also used a nail file, which is very handy to sand down some really tiny pieces of basswood. And I start to super glue everything together and keep adding every component. I've also super glued the disc in front of the vehicle. Sand down all the edges to make sure they're nice and smooth, and this is how it looks so far. Now to create the little handles, I've turned my drill upside down and I clamp it into a vise. I've inserted a piece of timber into it. I didn't have dowel at that time, so I just used some sanding paper to shape it until I had the right thickness I wanted. I mark up some reference line on it and use some tiny metal files to create the shape I wanted. So basically you've created a lathe or lath or whatever it's called without having to buy one. You can use nail files as well. They're not as strong as the metal files, but they're really good to finish it off and smooth it up. I was really happy with it. They look really cute. Then I made a hole at the base, used the tiniest drill bit I could find and insert a piece of wire with a bit of super glue into it. Apply some diluted brown paint. I've applied some white gesso, gold paint, and then I start aging it with diluted brown paint. To add the handles, I had to drill some really tiny hole using a drill bit that is the same size than the wire. I've also drilled from the sides and then used some super glue to attach those handles into the hole I've just drilled, and also added some wires and super glue on the side as well. For the drainage, I've used a piece of black warbler and I wrap it up with some wire mesh. Then I just shape it and press it into the gap. And there you go. I've printed some beer labels on the right scale on self-adhesive paper, and then I just cut them to size to fit my disc in front of my beer pull system, and it looks really cute. For the dartboard, I use a piece of basswood, then I cut to size, sand down and paint in black. I printed an actual dartboard on self-adhesive paper and apply it to the disc I've just painted. For the dart themselves, I used some black warbler and warm up a tiny little piece that I wrapped around some wire. Then used some plastic from packaging that I cut at an angle and super glue it to the wire very carefully. There you go. So now I'm going to talk about all the little bottles and glasses. First, I create some shapes with some super Sculpey. Any polymer clay will do to create bottles in different sizes. I've also created some glass with a disc of clay and a rectangle of clay that I pressed together until I had a nice smooth shape. I repeat the same system very carefully to create the wine glass. Those were a bit trickier to create, and also to make sure that the top part was properly connected to the base and they will not separate later on. So this is a selection of different shape I had. I cook it in the oven for probably 20 minutes, I think. Then to be able to copy them multiple times, I've hot glued them to a piece of cardboard. I've added some cardboard on the sides to create some walls. I've tried a new type of silicone this time. It's from Smooth On, and what is brilliant about it is that it's set in half an hour, so you don't have to leave it overnight. Overall, I'm quite happy with it. It's not too expensive and I had great result with it. So I mixed it together and pour it into my mold. Once it was completely set, I removed the cardboard, take the silicone out and remove the polymer clay shape. Then I had to fill up the mold with some clear resin. Because some of the openings were so small, I had to use some sculpting tools to make sure that the resin will actually go through and I will not have too many bubbles. It was an experiment at that stage. I wasn't sure how it would turn out. Some didn't work out too well, and some are honestly quite happy with them. They still need some sanding, and I've decided to paint some of them and add some label later on. Now, for those of you who are still watching and awake, I'm gonna talk about the frontage of the pub. As usual, I made a sketch up to scale showing every single component of it, and I've cut the window out with an X-Acto blade. So I used this as a template and applied to a piece of plywood to mark all the windows and doors that need to be cut out. I created a base with some timber and studs, and to save time I used a nail gun. I made sure it was the same height of the rest of the set. Then I apply my piece of plywood onto it and drill and screw it together to connect the base and the front. I've covered every opening with some thin strips of basswood. Add some frame around the door and every single window. I've also done the same thing on the other side of the panel because I knew there will be one scene in my film that will require to see the inside of that set from above. So for that scene alone, I had to create the whole thing on the other side of this piece of plywood. Then I start adding up different thicknesses, different width to create something very interesting with the front of the building. I've hot glued them together. I use my usual PVO sand relief for detail. I'm sorry, the image is completely out of focus. To create some texture on the pavement, I mixed some PVA with some sand. and apply it throughout. Once it was completely dry, I applied some black gesso to prime the whole thing and then some acrylic paint. I've aged the whole thing significantly, especially the pavement, by applying some diluted brown paint and remove the excess with a wet paper towel. For the windows, I've used some old packaging and cut them to the size of the window I needed. Then used the paper sand relief to fill up a template that I've created. Once they were completely dry, I flipped them on the other side, apply some white tack, and then do the same thing again. Once they were completely dry, I used some super glue to set them in place into the frame, and then used the paper sand relief as a final beads to bond everything together and cover the edges. Now I'm going to talk about the letterings on the front of the building, the royal oak. So I've printed the text I wanted to the right scale and with the right font, and covered with some baking paper. Then I used the paper sand relief to go over every single letter and let it dry overnight. I've cut the template out slightly bigger than each letter, so I can use that template to know exactly where to put each letter. And I use some super glue to set them in place. For the door, I just used different sheets of basswood that I hot glued together. I've cut some basswood out to make sure I have enough space for the tiniest hinges to settle in. And I've used the hot glue gun instead of the super glue, which last time got my hinges completely stuck. So I've learned my lesson. I then apply some diluted brown paint, decided to go for a glass panel with the same lettering, so I've used the paper sand relief and some plastic sheets, let it dry overnight, and once it was fully dry, I just super glue it in place. And cover that plastic sheet with a second layers to finish the back of the door. And if there's any gap, just use a tiny bit of filler or hot glue and then paint it. For the pub hanging sign, I've just used a bit of basswood painted black. I've printed some vintage sign to go onto it, add a bit of wire with super glue at the top of it, and then drill into the frontage to be able to set the sign in. And there you go. Thanks for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Next time I'm going to show you how to make a miniature office set. Take care.